Thank you very much, Jane, and a warm welcome to everybody. Welcome to another one in our Speak Up for Our Planet series of webinars. You'll know that we'll be looking at the issues that affect our planet from around the world on these webinars, and we're aiming to provide here a forum for debate and education, that people can inform themselves better and we can all come to a better understanding about what's going on around the world. The group is actually set up from a joint venture between Toastmasters International and the Round Table. I should say that we are completely apolitical. The information that you receive here, you're free to use as you wish, obviously. Regular visitors will know the format. Tonight, we have selected our topic for this evening, and we will be having two speakers who know their subject very well. Our intention is to finish within an hour, but we're happy to answer questions, and it may go on a little longer than that, as Jane previously said. Most of you will know that our topic tonight is the up-and-coming COP26. That's the Conference of Parties, the UN Climate Change Conference, which is due to be run in November in Glasgow. So a homegrown, or more or less homegrown event. Many scientists and environmentalists agree that this is a game-changing moment for the planet. The reality is we're certainly going to see a big event which will have some major ramifications for the future, whatever is decided. So tonight, our speakers are going to try and educate you on what the event is about, how it works, and also to give you some ideas as to how to amplify your voice and make your feelings heard if you should so desire. We've got two respected speakers tonight, but before I introduce them, I'd just like to highlight we're expecting to answer questions afterwards. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll try and get to them, depending obviously on how many there are after the speakers have spoken, and that's both speakers. So put the questions in as you go along. So now to our first speaker. We're delighted to welcome tonight from Denver, Colorado, Robert Youngberg, who is the president and founder of Sustainable Development International, who consult on national and international renewable energy. And indeed, Robert himself has great experience of the COPs, having been the observer delegate for the International Solar Energy Society to COP25. He's been kind enough to join us from Denver tonight, and I ask you to welcome Robert to the stage. Robert.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for the virtual applause. Yeah, it's really a privilege to speak with you tonight. And thanks for that introduction. I have quite a few slides, so I'm going to rush through a few of them. I'm going to send Jane a complete copy of my slides with the notes, so because a lot of information in the notes. So, and then I have links to almost all my notes. I do this presentation over 3 hours for the University of Denver, so I'm going to cram it down to about, I got rid of most of my slides, but I still have way too many, so I apologize if I rush through some, but you'll be able to look up all that information. And of course, students, they want that link. They want to be able to look up on the internet, and I don't know if they even have books anymore in college, but it seems to be mostly internet. So anyway, I'll just get going. And you see how I'm some way or another. There we go. You've seen a lot of these slides many times. Here's a typical fracking field in California. Here's a
actually, Robert, we haven't actually got the slides at the moment.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to share my screen. All right. Okay. There we go. Is that coming up for you? Or not? We practiced this earlier.
Yes, we can see
yes,
it now.
It is. Yes, it is. Sorry, I was on mute there.
All right, so, okay, well, so start over. Okay, so yeah, thanks for Rotary and Toastmasters. I actually belonged to Toastmasters back in college a long time ago, so um, make sure my, there we go. Okay, I think you've all seen these type of scenes. There's at least 10 countries, the population is over 20 million. Sorry, I get control of my thing here. Okay, this is a view from space of open tar sands and open pit mining. You've seen a lot of these type slides, and the theme I really like is the climate is changing, and why aren't we? Nearly enough. And you've seen a lot of these type of slides, how much the industrial revolution, once that started, and how much CO2 has been pumped into the atmosphere. It's just going up like crazy. This is one of the world standards in Hawaii at the Mauna Loa Observatory. They've been recording CO2 concentrations since back in the early 50s. And I just checked again a couple of days ago what the latest numbers were, and it's gone up actually 5 parts per million in just the last 3 months from the last time I checked it. So we're not making a lot of progress. Just a quick reminder, when the CO2 is released, about 50% of it is taken care of by ocean and land sinks, et cetera. And unfortunately, about 50% more of the balance is accumulated in the atmosphere. And only about 20, well, but of that 50% that's contained, about 25% is land and plants and trees, by the land, plants and trees and so on, and the other 25% absorbed into the ocean. But of course, the ocean capacity is with acid, with being more acid in the ocean and a higher temperature. That's not always. We're really worried that the ocean may not have that capacity, or it's declining. This is a chart that I haven't seen very often. Is that of course we look at what's happening with the temperatures worldwide, but actually, the land temperature is going up much faster than the ocean temperature. Of course, we're relying on the ocean of the temperature of the ocean not to increase so much. But land temperature on average is already at that 1.5 degrees centigrade, and that's the goal that we're trying to barely not reach. That's our goal, to not to exceed that number by 2030. So the land temperature is already that. And of course, the land is about 1/4 of the Earth's surface. So I'll talk a little bit about the United Nations and give a little history of the process. The United Nations General Assembly is the overall arching organization, and then underneath that is the United Nations Environmental Program, and then the World Meteorological Organization. They go together and they form what's called the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And these are the people that put out the reports that you've seen that are in the press a lot. They're really regarded as the world most credible organization for information on the climate change. And they don't actually do research themselves. What they do is pull together world experts and help them put those reports together. And then what we're talking about today is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then the Conference of Parties get together almost every year to do their negotiations around, it started with the Kyoto Agreement, and then now they're working under the Paris Agreement. So, but just a real quick history. This actually all started in about 1988 when the WMO and the United Nations Environment Program got together and established this IPCC. And then they hit in 1992, they held the big conference, and that's one you hear about a lot. And the people that have been in this a long time, that's their kind of their claim to fame is, hey, I was there in 1992 when all this started. And actually I have 2 friends that were there. It's almost right up there with the some of the big rock concert Woodstocks, which you're probably familiar with in the United States. Hey, I was at Woodstock. I was there. I was not personally, but people brag about it. Okay. So actually, there were 3 conventions that came out of there: biodiversity, climate change, and desertification. So, but the climate change is what we're going to be talking about. And at that, also at that time, and I'll talk about a little bit more later, is Agenda 21, and that sets the entire framework and philosophy behind these Earth summits. So in 1994, it went into effect. 196 parties signed that, and then they started out on the Kyoto Protocol, which is actually it was kind of prescriptive, saying you people or your countries, you will do this type of thing. You do this to meet your climate goals. Well, it didn't work very well. And the operational rule book was signed in '97, minus the U.S., of course. I don't think the U.S. has signed any of these. So the actual treaty then was ratified in 2005. And then in 2013, the IPCC that I mentioned earlier, they released these assessment reports. I think they're on number 7 now. But it was obviously that the Kyoto Agreement was not working. And so in 2015, at conference parties, COP21, the Paris Agreement was adopted. 197 nations signed that, but then there's a 2-step process. The committee signs it, but then the country has to adopt it. And basically, under the Paris Agreement, each party shall prepare, communicate, and maintain successive national determined contributions. That's what each country is obligated to do, or they're going to try to do. Parties shall pursue domestic mitigation measures with the aim of achieving objectives of such contributions. And mitigation is always on the front burner. We want to prevent it and not try to clean it up later with adaptation. Okay. And in April 2016, the United States became a signatory to the agreement. And then in September, it was actually signed by executive order by President Obama. And that made the whole thing become effective in November 4th, 2016. It was a little interesting side story. They were waiting for it has to have enough countries sign it that represent 55% of the global warming emissions. And they're waiting for the US and China to sign it, because then that would put them over the top of the 55% contributions. But each country wanted to be their own, be the one that took it over the top. So on a particular day in September, they got together and signed it at the same time. And I was actually in China at a low carbon development forum, which we go to almost every year. And so that was really kind of a fun experience to be part of the group, so to speak. However, we know what happened and later on in November in 2016, there was a change of administration in the United States. And the next year in June, we announced a formal withdrawal. However, with the new administration that came into power here in the United States in January, President Biden announced that they were going to be back in part of the Paris Agreement. So we're back in the game, so to speak. And I mentioned Agenda 21, and this was 1992, and it's really interesting, the preamble. This is the very first couple paragraphs that are in the Agenda 21, and this really drives the entire process and decision making. And I might just read that for a second. Humanity stands at a defining moment in history. Excuse me. We are confronted with a perpetuation of disparities between and within nations, a worsening of poverty, hunger, ill health, illiteracy, and the continuing deterioration of ecosystems on which we depend for our well-being. However, integration of environment and development concerns and greater attention to them will lead to the fulfillment of basic needs, improved living standards for all, better protection and managed ecosystems, and safer, more prosperous future. No nation can achieve this on its own, but together we can in a global partnership for sustainable development. Now you see there's nothing specific there about climate change, but all the overarching standards when the nations come up with their own contribution protocols, that this drives it all. They have to make sure people are held are protected from their health and welfare and so on. And one other thing, and I'll get more detail later, is they came up as part of that 92 preamble. They identified 6 major groups, and the typical women, children, role of indigenous people, local authorities, strengthening role of workers, business, industry, et cetera, and strengthening the role of farmers. So all of these are really geared around those 9 major groups, and then they've turned into those 9 constituencies, which I'll talk about. Okay, so I mentioned the nationally determined contributions. Now, however, developing countries, they're called least developed countries, LDCs. So now, wait a minute, it's hard for us to be held to the same standards as the developed countries. We're trying to develop, and we need a lot of energy, and that's typically carbon, et cetera. So they have their own special NAPAs, as they're called. And then within that, then they put those NAPAs in a registry. So then people know about them, and then other companies can come in, and countries and companies can help them out with financial needs, technology, et cetera. So anyway, there's basically those 2 different groups, the developed country and the least developed countries. And then there's also countries in transition, which is China and India and so on. Okay, if you're interested in following the actual numbers from the NDCs, there's this Climate Watch organization, and you can look them up on the internet, and they track the status of all the NDCs. And just recently, 5 countries, including the United States, submitted their new NDCs for 2020. They're done every 5 years, and then 2020 was the goal. But since with COVID, that they basically allowed another year to get those in. And the other thing that drives this and guides it is United Nations UNEP 17 sustainable goals. And again, they're very similar: poverty, education, women's issues, and of course, climate change. And then within the 17, there's 169 targets. So it gets to be really complicated, but this is one of the other driving documents that kind of dictate what people do or don't do. Okay, so I'll talk about the COP25. That was in Madrid. It was scheduled to be in Chile, but they were having some civil issues, and so with about 4 or 5 week notice, they moved it to Madrid, which was quite a change to set up a conference for 25 or 27,000 people. This is what the conference looked like as you walked in. This was like the very first morning, very little security, but very quickly the security really dominated. This is what the main assembly room looks like. It holds a couple thousand people, but it's really hard to get into. And then they had hundreds of other small rooms and so on of activities 16 hours a day. Most countries had really nice big pavilions where they did presentations 8 or 10 hours a day, social networks, that type of thing. Here's Japan and India's. And the big thing was when Greta showed up. It was an amazing thing when she spoke, and the people. They brought her in the side door, and I just happened to be standing there, and the paparazzi found out about it, and they come running around the corner, and the lead guy had a tripod with sharp points pointing forward and running forward to clear the crowd, and he almost got me with his tripod. But anyway, and then they had a rally. They said in Madrid later. I think they said there were at least 500,000 people in that rally. May have been a little bit exaggerated, but oops, sorry. Hit the mouse here. Oops. We had the International Solar Energy Society. We had a booth there, and Pelosi, and our entourage from the United States with a half a dozen other congressional reps came by and spoke to us quite a while. And then she said her famous words were, "Will we be back soon?" And then other dignitaries, Bloomberg was there. "I'm here because Trump isn't." He was running for president at the time. And then Jeffrey Sachs and a lot of other people just came by. So there's a lot of activities every day. A group called Climate Action Network gave a Fossil of the Day award to countries that are not doing very well. It was kind of a guy dressed up as a dinosaur, et cetera. USA received 3 in a period of 2 weeks, Japan 2, and so on for countries that may not really be on top of it. That was pretty political. Okay, just a brief overview. China, India, US, where they're leading, Australia and Indonesia, they're leading as far as climate, as far as CO2 contribution to the atmosphere. There's another group called the Climate Change Performance Index. This is a different, and they rank countries based on greenhouse emissions, 40%, renewable energy, 20%, energy use, 20%, and climate policy. Well, they don't give anybody a top ranking of 1, 2, and 3. They say everybody can improve. Sweden is actually at the top of the list, and United Kingdom number 2. So congratulations, United Kingdom, doing a fantastic job. Denmark, Morocco at the top, and at the very bottom is Iran, South Korea, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, right at the bottom. Okay, I'll try to defend ourselves a little bit, but in many aspects we do deserve that. And they have a website. They have the link that you'll get, and this is how they rank them based on the 4 parameters of greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy, energy use, et cetera. And again, these are the top quadrant there, and then see the rest of the countries. And I won't go through these because of time. But then down at the bottom here we have China, Iran, Canada, Iran, Saudi Arabia, et cetera. Now, China is actually fairly well up because they are doing a huge amount in terms of production and renewable energy installation. And they have some really aggressive goals, as Saudi Arabia, interesting, does now. They're trying to be 50% renewable energy by 2030. India, they're getting away from coal. This is their plan to do renewable energy. Huge installations of solar in particular. The United Nations, or the Conference of Parties in 22. There are 22 Conference of Parties, came up with something called the International Solar Alliance, and they are going to be investing in $1 trillion by 2030 for 1 trillion watts of installed capacity in the tropics, between the tropics of Cancer and tropics of Capricorn for the developing countries. And India, Modi is actually his group, his country, is the headquarters for this, and they're doing a huge amount in this area. There's a really good book if you get a chance. I've heard Barbara Finnemore speak several times. In fact, she was with us in China a couple of years ago, made a presentation on the same panel we were on. But I said, well, China saved the planet. Well, on one hand, they're doing a huge amount of carbon in the atmosphere, but at the same time, they're by far the largest installers and manufacturers of clean energy. This is to give you an idea. Cumulative solar capacity, China, US, so we're not doing too bad. Of course, we're also big countries and wealthy countries. And then as far as actual additions of solar, for example, China is by far building more solar than any other country. The US, we're not doing too bad, et cetera. And the EU as a whole is doing quite well. I saw this just a couple days ago on the news. It was on Bloomberg. Michael Mann, who has written a couple good books on climate change, and I just took a picture of the screen. And of course, he has his 2 books there right behind him in the background, in case you wanted to buy one. But he's looking at it from an economic viewpoint and financial viewpoint, and he's saying UK is right at the top of the list what they're doing between now and 2030. EU is doing well, Brazil, US, et cetera. And so he feels Canada is going to do really well, Australia, which have been kind of behind the curve. But and then there was this headline: Biden administration called Australian approach to climate change insufficient. We'll talk about being. I didn't really like that. I think what's the expression? The pot shouldn't call the kettle black. Sorry, we're not doing too well. But I just thought I'd throw up that some of the economic people really feel, the United Kingdom is right on top, and some of these developed countries will be doing a lot of good work. The EIA releases a study each year, and they're projecting by 2050, natural gas is going to be about 30%, renewables about 33%, the nuclear about 12%, and coal 13%. So that still leaves 52% coal, natural gas, and 48% renewable and nuclear by 2050. So that's really not good enough. And there's been some people criticizing that, saying the EIA has really not been very in favor of solar and wind, and have constantly under projected the contribution. But they did say their latest report saying that solar and wind will be providing at least 70, maybe 80% of all new energy, electro energy resources in particular. So they do saying that that is real important. If I'm running that, I'll try to hurry up here a little bit. I'm kind of running out of time, I think. But here's some really good sources. If you're not familiar with them, I'm sure you're familiar with Drawdown. They came out with a new review just last year on their projections. They have two scenarios that said that if we do a certain amount, we are probably only going to be able to reduce or sequester about 600 million million metric tons of carbon by 2050. If we have a real aggressive plan, we'll maybe be able to sequester and reduce up to around 1,200. So usually around 1,000 is the figure you hear thrown around. We need to reduce our carbon emissions and sequester about 1,000 million metric tons. And they're looking at, say, 25% electric production, 24% food, 21% industry, et cetera. And as they're saying we have to work on. This is their ranking. There's two scenarios that I mentioned, a low and a high. And depends on which one you're looking at. If it's really aggressive, onshore wind turbines are number one. Utility scale photovoltaics are number two. Reduce food waste, number three. Plant-rich diets, and they have over 82 of these actions in their document that they recommend. Now, if we quite often reduce food waste is actually number one if you look at scenario number one. So right now this is ranked in scenario number two. But it's really important to address all these. So again, please take a look at that when you get a chance. And 20 years after the original Rio meeting, it was a 22, Rio plus 20, and they adopted what's called the future we want, our common vision. And you can kind of glance through that. You notice that it's focused on economics, socially, environmental, sustainable future. So that's a really nice theme that came out of the 2012 Conference of Parties. And then I mentioned the nine areas that were originally defined in 1992. Rio plus 20 took those 9 and created what's called constituencies. Bingo, business and industry, NGOs, ENGO, et cetera, farmers, indigenous people, et cetera, the same list. And the group I represented was the International Solar Energy Society. It was under the research and independent NGOs. So there's like 3,500 of these NGOs that show up at the conference, and it's usually like 3 to 5 people per NGO. And so one thing that if you want to get involved, you can, excuse me, you can go to their site and look up, okay, what NGOs are going to be there in your local area? I did that for Colorado, and there's at least 40 different NGOs that are going to be there. Some of them, the University of Colorado State University has over 30 people that are going as part of a youth group, but most NGOs are limited to like 2 or 3 people. And I'm part of a group in Rotary that we're planning on attending in November. We haven't for sure heard how many people are going to be there and that type of thing, or it's going to be live or virtual. But we'll probably get about 3 people be able to go there and make and work in this area. I do want to emphasize, maybe I didn't at first, but about 1/3 of the people that are there after say of the 25,000, only about 1/3 of them are official country delegates. The other 2/3 of the people there are these NGOs. They're called observer delegates. They aren't part of the voting, but from my viewpoint, that's where all the action is. That's where all the collaborating and networking and working together happens. I'll just mention Rotary real quickly. Rotary has 7 areas of focus. And again, very similar: economies, education, mother, children, water, fighting disease, promoting peace, and protecting the environment. And the last one, protecting the environment, was just developed within the last year. It goes into effect July 1st. And it has one of the specific areas is about climate change. So Rotary is really behind that. And if you're interested in getting involved with various of these groups, the Environmental Sustainability Rotary Action Group, there's the website, the Rotary Climate Action Team, and then Rotary has developed a really strong relationship with Drawdown, and we have a Climate Solutions Task Force, and I work with most all those groups in one form or another. Okay, so I'll finish up. It's basically a thing I'm talking about. Change is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one that is most responsive to change. Of course, Charles Darwin. Okay, questions. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't run too far over time. I didn't get a hook, so maybe I'm not too bad.
Thank you, Robert. That was excellent, and we certainly got a wealth of information there. We're going to actually have the questions at the end of our second speaker's speech, so I encourage you. There are quite a few questions coming through already, which we will get to later in the chat. If anybody's got any more, just please put them in the chat and we'll get round to them. And in fact, Robert, you've got a chance now to have a look at some of those and perhaps contemplate your answers for some of them.
All right.
Just before I do hand over to our next speaker, I would like to ask you one question, which does seem to have been a little bit of a theme in the questions coming through, which is, do you think COP26 is fit for purpose? Is it going to achieve a meaningful result?
Yeah, really great question. One of the major criticisms of the whole COP process is that, and it is important, but countries, sometimes my viewpoint is the priority is for the individual countries to protect their own economic, energy needs, industrial needs, et cetera. And that is the major criticism of that whole process, is that countries are there to primarily, take care of their own needs under the umbrella or the guise of climate change. And of course, with the United States not being a part of that for the last, and that actually influence hasn't been all that great. China has really stepped in and taken over that leadership role and has major influence in that. Some to the good, some to the bad. But yeah, great question. It'll be really interesting now. I think the climate change has really taken hold as a critical issue for most industrial countries. I've seen a huge change here in the United States on the attitude toward climate change. So we have high hopes for COP26, but we'll see. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for that. Okay, moving on. Our next speaker, joining us from somewhat close to home, I think it's sort of Brighton area, isn't it, Nessie? Is Nessie Haynes Matos. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She is a core member of the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill Alliance and has been coordinating and contributing to its secondary research. She's also been responsible for coordinating expert contributors on the drafting of both the current and revised CEE bill. So Nessie has agreed to share with us her thinking on the COP26 event and also to give us some insights, should we feel strongly enough, on how we might best make our own voices heard, if we should so desire. So Nessie, welcome to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I don't know how I'm going to follow on from Robert, his wonderful presentation, but I will try. And I will try to keep to time. I have 15 minutes, don't I? So if someone could, yes, indicate if I do run over. I do have also a deck of slides and I will race through them. I've worked out I've probably got about 20 seconds on each slide. So let me share screens. One moment. Just to indicate if you can see the screen. Great. Okay, great. So this is our very colourful emblem and colours at the moment. So we began, just a little bit of background, we began the CE Bill Alliance, began about a year ago. It began very small. There was a group of activists from different NGOs and movements. And we came together with the idea of drafting a bill not from an activist standpoint, but really from to get the contributions of experts. So a range of scientists in climate science, ecology, and also deliberative democracy. So let me go. Right. So first of all, I'll just very quickly outline why, because there are a lot of bills, and I'm sure, and I know in the US as well, there are a lot of bills that are proposed. But why this bill is maybe different, hopefully, and radical, and definitely worth, getting involved and supporting. So most importantly, it deals with the climate and nature together as an integral whole. It is not aligned to any political party. So it really should be, it's something that should transcend party politics. I mean, it's a bill for humanity, really. And also it's non-prescriptive. So it's not actually got a list of things that we are promoting or banning. It's a framework and a set of principles. So this first idea of the structure of this bill was really inspired by Professor Tim Jackson. You may have read his book, Prosperity Without Growth. He's a very inspiring ecological economist, and yes, he's got many years of experience, and it was, we were very fortunate to have his great expertise. So, as I said before, the bill asserts that we cannot separate nature from the climate. As you know, COP26 and then CBD COP15, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, the equivalent to the Climate Convention, are separate entities. And so the bill feels that it needs to be one whole. And this idea actually came from an ecologist, Dr. Charlie Gardner and Professor Dave Golson, particularly. They really inspired us to say this kind of bill doesn't really exist or hasn't been proposed, and we need something like this. So I've already gone through the political aspect of it. The other thing that is really interesting is built in within the bill are interim targets, so they don't really align to the 5 yearly cyclical sort of electoral cycles. So there can be no delay or deferring of the responsibility. So if we can get this through as an piece of emergency legislation, it must begin immediately once it's passed into law. So the other thing that's really interesting about it is it's democratically radical in terms of it really does involve the public in a very structured way through a citizens' assembly. I wonder if many of you may have heard about the Climate Assembly UK that was run last year. And that was commissioned by six parliamentary party committees, and then also the French Citizens Assembly on climate mitigation also was held last year. That was actually commissioned by the French government. Previous to that, Ireland and Australia have themselves run citizens' assemblies to great effect. So just to reiterate, there's a framework and a set of principles, and then nothing prescriptive. It doesn't say what needs to be done. It just says we have two objectives. They need to be met, and that those objectives will be met through recommendations from a climate assembly, and expert bodies, independent expert bodies, and in conjunction with the Climate Change Committee and the Joint Nature Committee, JNCC, Conservation Committee, and then also under scrutiny of Parliament. So first of all, we have two objectives. One is climate, one is nature, but they are interlinked. So let me just, the thing is here with this bill, as I say, it's been written with the contribution of experts, and it also has been written with the idea that there must be a just transition, and also to protect against greenwashing. There's an awful lot of that going on both in the private and public sectors at the moment. So I've been through this. So what we will have are our objectives, our principles, and a strategy. That strategy will then be turned into policies. So in order to ensure that the Climate Assembly is legitimate, then there would be a tender for an independent body to set up that Climate Assembly. We talk about sortition, which is the way that there's a controlled random selection, which is the cross-representation of UK society. And then let me go on to there. There also are degrees of consensus that must be had in order for a recommendation to go through. So I've already talked about the expert bodies that would be part of this decision-making process, and that the strategy has to be scrutinised by Parliament. Right. So let's go straight on to the wording and the content of the bill itself. So this is the opening paragraph, and it just explains what the Secretary of State or the government will do should this be adopted into legislation. Again, these slides will be available. So the first objective is about the climate. It actually refers to the Paris Agreement, the UK, and the UK's contribution. But what it also includes is our historical emissions. As you know, although on paper we're performing very well with our territorial emissions, we actually have, as you know, carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for centuries. So there's a huge time lag, and those cumulative emissions start from the Industrial Revolution, of course, where the UK, as birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, has a lot of responsibility. and to mitigate faster and take more responsibility on doing its fair share globally. So one of the goals is, as everyone knows, in the Paris Agreement, there was a pursuit to keep global mean temperatures below 2 degrees, and to try and pursue 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. So in the bill, we've embedded this into our first objective. However, there are two main pathways that scientists have identified, which are sort of probabilities, if you like. So the main pathway is that the world has a 50-50% chance of staying below 1.5, and that's one pathway. And most advanced economies are on that. Our country also has signed up to that, to be carbon net zero by 2050, with a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5, or let's say a rate consistent with, obviously our country can't on its own keep those temperatures, but consistent with that pathway. But in our bill, we're looking to the more ambitious pathway, which is at least a 66% chance of staying at a rate consistent with staying below 1.5. So that effectively means our carbon budget, our allowance, which is actually at the moment we have carbon budgets that are in law legislated for. But it will mean if we adopted these measures and this objective, it would mean our carbon budget would be effectively much smaller, or carbon budgets would be smaller, and that we would then have to, the rate of our mitigation, of our reducing our actual emissions, would have to be steeper and quicker. So our second objective is our nature objective, and it is to reverse the decline in the state of nature in the UK. We're still, the wording is still being developed, but the most important part is that there's no later than 2030. And this was inspired by the Leaders' Pledge for Nature. I don't know if any of you have heard about it. It was signed in 2020 by many global leaders, but it wasn't legally binding. It's another pledge. So, but this inspired the nature target, that we really wanted a target that was as stringent as the climate target. So we also wanted there we are. We also wanted to acknowledge that, of course, we have devolved powers within the United Kingdom, particularly for nature, so that there would be autonomy in each of the countries, the United Kingdom, and that's stated in the bill. Timing was really important. We wanted to keep this an emergency bill that would be an emergency law, so we kept really tight timeframes. At the moment, for example, the Environment Bill is going through Parliament when we exited the EU to replace the environment legal framework. But the worry is that there's a long time frame for that, and it actually hasn't been yet. It's still going through Parliament in its second report stage, and of course, as we know, Parliament's in recess at the moment. So we wanted something that would actually speak to the emergency. Let me go. So here, I talked about this framework, and then I just want to quickly say that this Climate Assembly, in order to meet these two objectives, they need to also apply certain principles. Because in a climate assembly, you may be worried, well, maybe people don't want to be particularly strict about the kind of recommendations for this strategy. So we did set some principles. So, for emissions mitigation, we wanted real reductions in our anthropogenic emissions, our human-made caused activity that causes emissions. So that looking from heating homes to transport to manufacture. So that was our first principle. Next one was about our natural carbon sinks. We are very, as Robert's already touched on, nature provides through the carbon cycle and other cycles this wonderful ability to sequester carbon dioxide. However, it's just not sufficient. I mean, it's the carbon cycle has been disrupted because of our activities. So, but there's still a very important task ahead to restore and expand these natural carbon sinks, and at the same time regenerate ecosystems. So this is really an interesting one. This one is principle around carbon mitigation. Currently, the UK and most of the world use territorial-based emissions accounting. So that means counting all the emissions that we produce within our country's borders. So on paper, we've done actually pretty well, as Robert's already pointed out, because we've been able to switch to renewables. We use very, very little coal now. But the main thing is that we've gone from being a manufacturing-based economy to a service-focused economy, which means in actual fact, we've exported a lot of our emissions through, and now we have embedded emissions through our imports, because we mainly import lots of manufactured goods that we use. And this is not accounted for in the present way of, in fact, the way the Paris Agreement actually does its calculations. So there's this call, it's very ambitious, for consumption emissions accounting. So we actually, because we are net importers of emissions, not net exporters of emissions. So do you remember the about creative accounting? This is where the idea comes from, that we're not actually accounting for what we actually use at the moment, presently. This touches on the way we mitigate. I mean, the elephant in the room is really that we need the advanced economies need to live with more degrowth, maybe a little less materialism. However, there's a lot of ideas of carbon net zero. So you've got, the offsetting with speculative technologies. So in this bill, we don't touch on negative emissions technologies or natural climate solutions specifically. But what we do say is that any steps to mitigate must not damage ecosystems and human health, food or water availability. That's a really important principle. This is really important as well. We wanted to ensure that fossil fuels are kept in the ground. That sounds really obvious, but there's quite a race for fossil fuel exploration and extraction around the world. So this again was a really important clause to have in here, principle. So this is about our supply chains. So again, just as we talk about consumption emissions and embedded in everything we import, we wanted to also look at our ecological footprint and to mitigate for that as well. So again, a lot of our supply chains, whether directly or indirectly, have a huge impact on our ecological footprint, which is very high. And then nationally, we're looking at, of course, restoring and regenerating our own ecosystems. I'm not sure. So the other really important principles were to make sure there was a fair and just transition, and that these recommendations
1 minute, Nessie.
Okay, did not, unfairly impact parts of society who were particularly vulnerable, and also the transition from intensive and ecosystems high intense sectors that would need to make a shift to a sort of deep green economy. We have legally binding annual targets, which at the moment the CCC has we have carbon budgets that are they're not 5-yearly, are they 5-yearly cycles? So we wanted something that was more frequent, and really we've come to the end. So we have a very tight time frame of the setting up of the assembly. We have some percentages of consensus of what needed to be, when a recommendation would go through to the strategy. And finally, I can tell you that we had a mechanism whereby if there were any changes in the science, there'd be amendments made to the strategy, and that would go through due process. So, for example, it would go through again a climate assembly, it would go through the expert bodies and be again scrutinised by Parliament. And that's it. So, what can you do? Here, just quickly, because you may actually ask, here are some of our supporters already, the bill, who've signed up. And we have huge guides on our website for campaigners. So, of course, the most obvious is writing to your MP. But there's also going through social media, through Twitter. There's a lot of assistance on our web. If you go to our website, that it's all really there about how different ways of supporting the bill. And that's it, really. And I can start sharing.
Excellent. Thank you, Nessie. Marvelous. A lot of interesting stuff there, Nessie, and particularly that stuff at the end. Can you pop your website link into the chat so that people can take a note of that?
I have the website and I will send it out to everybody
Excellent.
who's registered. But yes, put it on the chat as well for anybody who isn't registered and whose email address I don't have.
Brilliant, brilliant. Right. Well, we thank you for both those speeches, and now we'll get to some questions that have been pouring in. So if we start at the top, is it the speed of warming rather than the warming itself that is the principal concern?
I'll take that. Yeah, it's both. It's going up faster, and the rate of increase is increasing. In other words, accelerating. So the idea is to try to, instead of an upward curve, we're trying to get it on a straight line or get that line out flat. So yeah, that's an excellent question. But right now, it's not only increasing, but the rate of increase is increasing, like accelerating in your car.
Okay, thank you for that. Will some countries be beneficiaries of a warming planet? I don't know who, but if yes, e.g. maybe Russia or Canada, what interest do they have in limiting CO2 emissions?
It's warmer weather is always nice. Crops grow better, but part of it is, of course, as the climate change, the crops move, and the optimum growing conditions move north or south, depends which part of the hemisphere you're in.
So Russia or Canada might have an interest.
The negative far outweighs the benefits. I'll just put it that way.
For everyone.
Yeah, for everyone.
Okay. How do we get to net zero if we cannot store energy from renewables? Storage
is really important. We did a lot of research actually for our national labs a couple decades ago on storing energy. And right now, the big focus is on storing electricity with batteries, with actually storing energy in your electric car so the utility can use that at different times. The cost of batteries is dramatically decreasing, and it'll continue that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We need a lot of storage for the peaks and season and times of the day and year when we don't have solar and wind.
Okay, thank you. All the promises and words used by all of the groups that you highlighted in your speech are great, but are you confident that there is action behind those words? What is the evidence you have to support your response?
It's
do you think,
really easy
Nessie?
to get depressed when you see what's actually happening. A friend of mine teaches sustainability at the college level, and she never starts out without how bad it is, because the kids just get too depressed. But no, I honestly don't have a huge amount of confidence that this is going to happen. Particularly, I'm looking at it from the U.S. viewpoint, and perhaps with Biden things will turn around, but I just don't have a huge amount of confidence. I have 12 grandchildren, and that's why I'm doing this.
So, okay. Is technology going to save us then?
Say again, sorry?
Is technology going to save us?
Yeah, well, no. In fact, a think tank in EU said, investing in renewable energy and energy conservation, the technology and financing is not going to save us. We have to cut back on our consumption.
But could we use technology to take CO2 out of the atmosphere?
Mostly around forestation, reforestation, things like that, farming practices. The great big machines that have those windmills on the wall, on the hill, they're not. I don't have much confidence in them at all.
I can just add that COP26, you're right to be skeptical, but all I can say is the bigger opportunity, at least for the UK, to show leadership as co-hosts of COP26 is to actually I think structural change has to come through legislation ultimately, but even bringing something like the principles and ideas to the table, to the COP, that have come out of things like the bill, the ideas of those, and there's so many similar ideas of joining nature with climate, will definitely, I mean, Robert will know, he's been there, that behind closed doors, there's quite a lot of, I mean, I imagine egos and people wanting to, leave a great legacy of being leaders and being seen to save the world. So whilst on the one hand, you can be skeptical, on the other hand, there's no bigger summit than this. So we need to just put all our efforts behind it. I mean, it's just some months away, and this is an opportunity. And it can be a pinch. It's from grassroots, but also governmental as well. It needs to be sort of a pincer approach, really.
What makes an NGO influential? Number of voters they can represent? What is it that you think makes NGOs influential?
Part of it is, the number of people that they might be affiliated in terms of countries, but NGOs quite often are international organizations, so they have a certain amount of influence that way. But I think, like Nessie was just saying, that you have to have a top-down and a bottoms-up approach to this. And just like in most of your government organizations, you have the people up front that are the say council people or presidents or governors or whatever, but it's really people getting involved and putting pressure on them where the action is going to have. So I think they have a lot more influence you might think. There's a group called Small Island Developing States, and these are islands that are threatened. There's 4 or 5 areas in the world, and they have a huge amount of influence because they are definitely threatened.
Yeah. Thank you. One for Nessie here. How do citizens' assemblies get formed? How does a citizens' assembly get formed?
Oh, so they usually throughout, for example, if the bill were passed, it would be the government who would need to commission for an independent expert body who expert in deliberative democracy, who sets up, for example, Involve or DemSoc, who would actually set up the assembly. They would do the sortition process of random selection, which is as I say, a fully representative selection of society. And then they would set the questions. The questions would be based around the objectives. And then they would also organize all the expert witnesses.
Okay.
I can actually leave a link to how a UK Climate Assembly was run. It was all on online for people to watch, so that would be interesting if
Might be
people are not
useful
so
or to
familiar.
share that
that'd
with
be interesting.
Jane.
Yeah.
Another one for Nessie. What do you think a Citizens Climate Assembly will achieve in terms of holding any UK government to account for achieving their targets?
So that's a really good question, and that was the issue around the Climate Assembly, was that it wasn't legally binding. So of course, what we've done with the bill is we've embedded it into the bill, that if it would become law, then it is actually the Climate Assembly the recommendations would be part of policies that would come out. So it's through the bill that those recommendations would become legislation.
And the government could be then held to account over them.
Yes, exactly. In fact, we've had the bill written, as I say, by experts and also lawyers. So lawyers have checked that it would be robust enough for judicial review.
I think we've already established that the UK has been, whilst being a bit of a leader, has also been fairly good at accounting in the way that it delivers the figures. So is it written in a way that guards against that kind of activity as well?
Yeah, I mean, things like the interim targets are things that are like the pathway for being at a rate consistent with a 66% chance, also including consumption emissions accounting. That would all be factored in, and the CCC, which is our climate change committee, would have an expanded role in having to abide by those, because it would become again a piece of legislation.
Excellent. Okay. Just looking for any more questions.
Bob Handley's comment is a nice one. Accepting the UK as a net importer of emissions, but if these emissions are counted in, say, Germany or China, then they are included globally? Question mark, or is everybody avoiding them?
No, this is the problem of double accounting, which is mentioned in the Paris Agreement, that there should be an avoidance of double accounting. So we are really aware of this, and within the bill, in our first principle, we account for the territorial emissions that just have to be reduced as ASAP. But also, one of the important things about lobbying our MPs is that at COP, it would be absolutely amazing if the UK government actually took a lead on actually suggesting there's some negotiation among the advanced economies to start, who are net importers of emissions, to start making those accounts, so that there's that system of accounting. Because otherwise it could be quite complicated. They'd have to make sure there isn't a double accounting mechanism.
Yeah, I might add this. That's a major controversy within the national NDCs, the national contributions, because there's a has been double counting in some areas, and then also if a developed country invests some money to minimize climate change in a developed country, do they then not do their own work that they should? In other words, they're passing it off to the other country and trying to take credit for that. So that's a major discussion at the COPs.
One of the great incentives, though, is that if the UK suddenly said, okay, we want to start accounting for our imported emissions, then it would actually be that, say we were importing from developing countries or emerging economies, we would actually maybe encourage to give some financial technological transfers to those countries for them to start producing in a more low carbon intensive way. So it's a win-win. Because it wouldn't be in our benefit, for example, to have to import goods where we paid the price for those embedded or embodied emissions. So it would be for us to encourage those exporters to lower somehow their emissions or the way they produced and manufactured goods. It may mean that, again, we've been made very rich off the back of being carbon intensive since the Industrial Revolution. That's why we're such a wealthy country. So it is our responsibility to take that lead.
There's a global business standard for companies, international companies, to account for their emissions. And there's three ways. One, what do they consume internally as part of their processing, manufacturing? What do they import from other into their system? But also, what do they export? In other words, what is the impact of their products exporting? There's a local beer company said, 97% of the carbon that's addressed to as far as our beer is not under our control. It's the energy that goes into the growing of the hops and the transportation and cooling, et cetera. So that's really important to try to account for all that. And in some countries, they're doing a fantastic job, and I don't want to pick on Norway, but they're doing a fantastic job internally, but they're all exporting a huge amount of oil. So those externalities being counted? I think that's partly what you are addressing too. And of course, for the US, all our stuff is manufactured in China. Do we account for that? Because we're not, because China's producing the carbon for our consumption. So it's very complicated.
I mean, I read from a BES government department report recently that we have one of the highest per capita per head of our carbon footprint in the world.
Yeah,
so
US, I think, is just about double anybody else. And then most of Europe is about half of the US. And that, and then there's a question about population, I believe, on this CAT, and that, some of the statistics you read has said that the typical non-developed countries use 1/10 of the resources that someone in the US, for example. And as they develop, and China is a classic example, they've moved something like 500 million people up to a kind of a middle class standard. And of course, that's one of the big reasons why their carbon footprint has expanded tremendously, just because of that development issue. It's do you deny people development just because they're going to produce carbon? And it's a very difficult issue.
And Robert, you will know better than I that, of course, the cumulative emissions that are presently in the atmosphere are emissions that came from decades and decades ago, even centuries ago. So we could trace the UK emissions to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, even if we were at net zero right now, that accumulated carbon in the atmosphere is going to be with us for a long, long time.
And on that lovely note.
Well, I did want to make one quick comment. So there was a question about cook stoves. And that's one of SRAG's 5 main emphasis at COP26 is around clean cook stoves. We actually shared a booth with the Clean Cook Stoves International, really amazing group. And they're really active at the COP. They make presentations and news conferences constantly. They're really a great group.
There are some statements here, which I'm sure you've all had a chance to read. Everybody's looking at Boris to be a leader, but he just opened up a coal mine. I'm not sure that actually happened, did it? Does anybody know whether that's been agreed or not?
I thought it didn't.
It's certainly up in the air. I think it's still up for debate, but